Hello, Liselotte Odgaard. Happy New Year, and thank you for taking time for this interview. You are currently a visiting senior fellow at Hudson Institute, and your work focuses on US-China-Europe relations. Actually, the world is focusing on a possible new EU-China-US triangle under the new American administration, if that's confirmed. President Trump is leaving abundant diplomatic legacy both on China and on EU's issues, putting America first, weaponizing tariffs, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement, and reconsidering the Americans' contribution to the NATO in Europe, etc. While France and Germany and some other European countries are openly looking forward to a transatlantic new era, China seems to have very little illusion on an improvement with the US. Do you think Biden will continue to be tough on China, from human rights to strategic and structural compatibility, but perhaps in a more predictable way?
I am one of those people who would argue that the difference in Trump's and Biden's China policy will not be as great as many people think. There will obviously be a difference in style. For that reason alone, I expect we will have more predictability and stability, which is always a good thing, especially with China, between China and the West. However, I think a lot of the key points from the Trump administration will be continued by Biden once he gets his China policy together, which may take up to a year, because really he is elected to resurrect and ensure domestic economic recovery in the United States. I don't see him changing the strategy of economic and technological decoupling from China. It may be a slightly milder version, but essentially I think that will continue. It will be in a more civilized way, but I don't think it will be less tough, because if there is one thing that the US agrees upon, the Republicans and the Democrats, it's to have a tough approach to China. And even if Biden tries to scale back some of that, China is certainly going to decouple. and so even if there's a desire not to go down that route, the US will have to follow suit, because China has really woken up to the fact that they cannot rely on supplies and on economic interdependence anymore with the West. That's not a safe route to get the supplies they need to sell their products, etc.
Many of Biden's China policy advisors are from the Obama administration, at the time when the US government tried in vain to transform China into a more democratic, less repressive, and more law and rule-abiding regime. To what extent do you think Biden's China policies will be different from that of Obama's?
We're in a different situation now. You know, the US no longer believes that China can be socialized into being a liberal power in the way that European countries and the US would define it. And China is quite overtly pursuing an alternative world order with its Belt and Road Initiative, its economic vision for the world. And it creates standards in all kinds of areas and tries to change the values of the system through its UN engagement, for example. It doesn't just accept the framework, it tries to change the rules through its engagement, for example, in the UN Human Rights Council, cooperating with like-minded authoritarian states to change what is acceptable values. And that is, I think, the challenge today. And so I don't see the US trying to be more lenient on China or believe that they can persuade them.
The European Union is in a tough spot since the US-China trade war, and the recent concluded European-China investment deal has raised perplexity on both sides. Both Trump and Biden's advisors addressed concerns on Europe's approach to China. How will Europe position itself between Washington and Beijing? How is the perspective going to change under Biden's presidency? And what role does China or China's policies play in the new transatlantic relationship?
I think they're very important. They could be a force for bringing Europe and the US closer together, or they could set them apart. The agreement on the objectives vis-a-vis China is very big. They both agree that China is too militarily aggressive, that they breach the rules of market economics, that they, do forced joint ventures and all these things. But if you focus on instruments, that's where the differences are, how to deal with it. So there needs to be an acceptance of using different instruments to reach the same goals. Maybe the US will be more engaged in multilateral institutions with Europe under Biden. But again, the US will be confrontational and provocative towards China, much more so than Europe. So it won't change that much in reality. So the important is to coordinate around the objectives and accept instrumental differences. Europe is going to try and position itself as a middle power, that doesn't choose sides between the US and China, but still wants to be closer to the US because essentially they're defending the same liberal world order, and that remains more important for Europe than anything else. So they will still be an ally of the US, but they will have a more independent interest to pursue. They will also want to maintain much trade with China that the US will likely not do. They don't like the decoupling idea. So there are going to be big issues that will set Europe and the US apart, which means that Europe no longer wish to be so dependent on the US. So they will pursue strategic autonomy. And that means that the US cannot always count on Europe following the US lead anymore. Those days are over, and the US has to get used to that. And that's a process which I think is not solved just by, the election of Biden. The US will continue to demand that Europe pays more for its own security. And since Europe and the US have slightly different perspectives of what is the main threat, that will again create some ripples in relations between the US and Europe, because for the US, clearly China is the main competitor because China threatens to take over the US position in the world. So they're directly challenged, not only, with different, China's different policies on economic and industrial and tech policy, different values, but also on their essential, ability to be the dominant power in the world. Europe does not face that challenge. And that means that Europe, together with a lot of other middle powers in Asia, for example, South Korea, India, Singapore, many countries to varying extent, they're not interested in choosing sides. And Europe is not going along, with that idea that we have to compete with China across the board and use fairly tough, provocative, hard power methods to deal with China. Europe agrees that there is a number of problems with China's policies, especially in the area of economics and industrial policies and tech policies. But they want to show the US that you can deal with these problems in diplomacy and demonstrate that you can get China to, you can push China to alter its ways because we're economic heavyweights, and as such, China has an interest in adapting, and that's how to deal with China in Europe's view. And they have just showed that they have just completed in December 2020 a comprehensive investment treaty in principle with China. So it still needs to be ratified, and that's not likely to happen until 2022. So it can change. But with that treaty, has persuaded China that Europe should have access to their market access to their technology equipment sector, that there needs to be more transparency about state subsidies and how they are used. They need to be a ban on forced joint ventures in the areas that the agreement covers, which also includes at least parts of the tech sector. And that Europe concludes this treaty before Biden is into office to show the US that they intend to continue to go down this route of trying to use their economic power, which is considerable in Europe's case, to push China to change their ways. And they're going to use diplomatic means and agreements. They're not going to have, this tough approach to China that the US has opted for. And that will continue to create ripples in transatlantic relations as well. You've already seen loads of criticism of the EU completing this treaty with China, because it's said that that will prevent Biden from, get a first hand on Europe and, decide what they're going to do about China, because Europe has already sort of set a course that they're not likely to deviate from. But in my opinion, I think seen from a European perspective, it's a smart move, because it shows that yes, we can have much better relations, but the US has to accept that Europe may not want to use always the instruments that the US demands. And the price for having a more independent and stronger Europe that can take care of their own security problems, which in Europe's case is more Russia, the Middle East and North Africa. And although China is a security, or at least a strategic rival, it's not the main opponent of Europe. And so for that reason alone, Europe has other interests vis-a-vis China, and they are not willing to make China an enemy across the board and use the hard power means that the US usually uses, and that will continue under Biden. That doesn't mean that transatlantic relation cannot be improved, but it requires that the US acknowledges that if they do want a stronger, more independent, and more assertive Europe to help them also with China in the Indo-Pacific, the US needs to understand that Europe will also pursue its own interests, and they're not always the same as the US. So the job for Biden is to talk to Europe about how can they better coordinate and tell each other or clarify where do they agree on China and where do they differ. I think there's a lot of agreement, because I think the basic objectives of Europe and the US are actually the same. They understand that China is a different kind of power, and there's a limit to cooperation. So Europe will continue to prefer the US as its partner. And it has also tried to show this under Trump. It's just that Trump lumped Europe together with China in saying that Europe was, feeding and free riding on the US economy as much as China was. There are growing quarrels between Europe and the US, for example, in the tech area. And again, they will continue. The European Commission has just proposed legislation that will, hit on intermediate platforms to prevent them from preferential treatment of their own subsidiaries, etc. In the tech area, the US-European relationship could get worse, and there's a risk of a kind of tech war, which would be really bad because China would benefit from a transatlantic tech war. Hopefully, Biden's more diplomatic approach can ensure better coordination and understanding and put a damper on these conflicts. Europe is also unhappy about China's Taiwan policy. It has also adopted sanctions against Hong Kong. It's not happy about, its violent skirmishes with India on the border. It's not happy with China's South China Sea policy. It has also criticized China for its handling of the Xinjiang and Uyghur issue, the Tibet issue, just like the US. And they have common values still. Both of them want to preserve a liberal world order, which includes political and civil values. And that Europe is one of the only continents to support the US in that, because Asia's commitment to liberal world order, first of all, Asia contains many different countries, not all of them liberal at all, but to the extent they're liberal, they may only be it in an economic way and not in a human rights or political way. So, there is a need for the US to coordinate with Europe so that they focus on these common objectives, also to push back against China's illicit economic and industrial practices and its military assertiveness. To do that, I think Biden will have an easier time, but really this process started already under Trump. There is a sort of understanding that this coordination needs to take place, and France's growing military role in the Indo-Pacific, and the fact that France is dragging along European countries. Germany is now also on board in this with their recent Indo-Pacific strategy, has been very welcomed by the US under Trump. Some European countries, such as France, performs operations in support of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, supporting the US efforts. But unlike the US, Europe will not sail very close up to Chinese reefs and occupied features in the South China Sea, because they do not want to be unduly provocative against China in this way. And in fact, in practice, the US accepts this. They think the most important thing is that Europe starts showing, a military footprint in the Indo-Pacific that is essentially aimed at the same objectives as the US, namely to cooperate with allies and partners with the purpose of preventing that China shows military assertiveness, aggressiveness, breaks international law in and beyond its near abroad. So I actually don't think that the transatlantic relationship vis-a-vis China is in such a bad state, for starters. The legacy from Trump, you've heard, of course, at the strategic high politics level, there's a lot of arguments, but underneath that, coordination and cooperation has in some areas been quite successful. And Europe is planning also from the EU side to strengthen this increasing military footprint in the Indo-Pacific by creating some frameworks that can support the powers that want to participate in this, because there isn't going to be 27 EU member states agreeing on, playing a military role in the Indo-Pacific. It's far away. Not all countries agrees with this policy, but what the EU can do, and increasingly does, and which means it's so important for all the member states, is that it can be supportive of groups of countries that wishes to take a lead in an area, not forcing all countries to go along, but then creating mechanisms that means that the countries that wants to do, for example, give Europe a military footprint in the Indo-Pacific, they can go ahead and be helped in some ways by the European Union without, having to wait for all the 27 member states to agree. And that's what makes the EU quite effective today, actually. I just doubt that the Biden administration will go down that route because, as I mentioned before, there is bipartisan agreement in the US that they need to have a tough approach to China. And the days where you could, trust in agreements, written agreements with China, those days are over. They're not willing to test that anymore. And that will continue to set Europe and the US apart to some extent on China issues, hence a very strong need for coordination so that, Europe and the US does not end up in each other's throats, hence preventing them from dealing with China.